Okay, welcome. This is Senior English B, and our objective for the hour is to make some observations about Mary Shelley's classic novel, Frankenstein. So I'm working off of a couple of assumptions, and if these for you don't work, don't worry. I'll still be able to kind of help you out. One, that you have looked at some kind of plot summary of this novel. The packet, pages 1 through 3, is the best place to start. Two, that you have, if not completely read the novel Frankenstein, you've at least kind of gotten into that novel and started reading it. Our objectives this morning are two parts. You may want to jot this down. One, we want to try to address the primary plot line of the story, make sure we understand the overarching themes, messages of the story, to try to make some relevance. Two, we want to ask about the title and the subtitle of this novel, because we have to write a paper next week, Monday, about this topic. Shelley called the novel Frankenstein. That's the title that most everyone's familiar with, although a large number of people don't know this was a novel. When they hear Frankenstein, back to our video of yesterday, they immediately think of two things: movies, and of course they think the monster kind of walking around all goofy like is Frankenstein, which is to say they know absolutely nothing about the novel. You know, it's a simple indicator. I mean, if somebody starts talking to you about Frankenstein and then references the monster that's been created by the doctor, you immediately know that individual is working with some kind of, movie references, and clearly doesn't know the novel. But Shelley called the novel Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. That's what she called the novel. And as academics, we want to ask this question. What's a Prometheus and why should I care? B, why would she call the novel the Modern Prometheus? Okay. Now let's start with some observations that are It Gets Dark at Night obvious. We're reading Shelley's Frankenstein because we are in the midst of an analysis and study of the English Romantic writers. The easy working date for this time period on your timeline is 1800. It works very nicely. Okay, 1800. This is the time of Wordsworth, Byron, Shelley, Coleridge, and the rest of them. Notice I said Shelley. Shelley is a great romantic poet, but that's a different Shelley than the Shelley who wrote Frankenstein. We have Shelley the poet, that's a guy. Then we have Shelley the woman, interestingly 18-year-old girl, who writes this classic novel that for many people is considered one of the greatest novels ever written. She wrote it before the age of 20. And as we learned yesterday from our video, she had a very tragic life, didn't she? She wrote the novel and then ostensibly her life kind of completely fell apart. At the time of the writing of the novel, she was the lover of the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, who we will, by the way, study in weeks to come. All right. So let's begin by pointing out this is a romantic novel. Secondly, this is a novel that we often will refer to as a Gothic novel. Gothic novel. Now, we use the term Gothic today, of course, in its instantiations of issues of wearing black and heavy eyeliner and walking around some park in the middle of the night all alone, and all these kinds of bizarrities, right? Listening to certain kinds of music and etc., wearing military boots or all these kinds of things. But when we use the term Gothic in its academic instantiation, we simply mean of or related to the macabre, to the issues of death, and trying to understand those issues, okay? The mysterious as well, Gothic, okay? And to some degree, this is certainly very much going to play right into that, that timeline of other Gothic tales. Last year as juniors, you studied the great poet and writer Edgar Allan Poe, who would write, for example, The Fall of the House of Usher and some of those other kind of Gothic tales. Interestingly, he's across the pond right at about the same time writing those kinds of stories, okay? You could argue that Frankenstein is one of the first quote-unquote ghost stories, although there's really no ghosts there. And once you get into the plot line of the story, you begin to realize right away, Shelley's doing something more than just writing an entertaining text. She is going to be challenging some fundamental ideas. Now I'm going to ask a question, and then we're going to go through a process of trying to answer it. Why is it, this is my question, why is it that the novel Frankenstein was boycotted by most religious people of the day? Okay. People of Europe, this novel, bad. That's what they said, bad. Worse than bad, they said dangerous. In fact, there are many practicing religious readers today who will say Frankenstein is a very dangerous novel. Now, I'm asking, because Judice just kind of went like this, I'm asking this question like, why? And by the way, I'm going to take away real quickly one answer that some of you maybe will have, and that is the answer that, well, in the novel, you have a guy trying to bring people back from the dead, and that's quote-unquote kind of trying to play God. Hello, the people who read this novel in 1800, who were religious people, they didn't believe the events of the novel to be true. Okay, so in other words, they didn't read the novel going, uh-oh, somebody actually brought somebody back from the dead. That's bad. No. We need to understand, these are sophisticated religious readers. They don't buy the storyline. They see it as what it is, mythology, right? A made-up story. They understand that. And yet, in spite of that, Mr. Harder, they still boycott this novel and call it dangerous. Our question will be, why? Now, let's backtrack. Let's begin with some basic level 1 plot summary of this story. All right? When we look at this story, we are ostensibly looking at a story about an individual who is on a quest. Who is that individual? The namesake of the novel. His name is Frankenstein. By employment or by hobby or by profession, he is what? What is he? What does he do? What's his job? He's a doctor, isn't he? Yeah, he's a doctor, isn't he? All right? Now, through a series of events that we'll not get into a lot of detail, through family events and the like, he suffers the most excruciating of pain sorrows, namely death. And he doesn't like it. So he decides to do something about this thing called death. His quest is to do what? He wants to conquer death, doesn't he? He wants to bring someone back from the dead. He wants to create life. Okay? And in the process of creating life, overcome the terrible sorrow that is attended to his passing of his loved one. Is he successful? He is. To the degree that he creates life, he is successful, isn't he? Right? But, is he successful? Well, that all depends on how you define success. Because the minute that he reanimates this matter, this life, this body comes to life, what does he do? I'm sorry, say it out loud, Miss Benitez. He freaks out. That's a good way to say it. He freaks out, and then he takes good care of this.
No.
He doesn't even give the monster a name, does he? He doesn't name it. He's immediately ashamed of it. The monster is forced to have to grow up and live on its own. And in the middle part of the novel, the monster, never given a name, goes through a series of very quick educative processes. Very quickly learns how to read. By the way, the book that he uses to learn how to read, interestingly, is what book? Did anyone catch this? It's the poem. It's the poem. It's the poem, not Ancient Mariner, although that's a fine guess. It will be the poem Paradise Lost by John Milton, the story of the Garden of Eden creation story. That's John Milton, Paradise Lost. Interestingly, the person who's the most kind to him is an old man who, what?
Blind.
He can't see. He's blind. Now what's interesting about that? Well, what do we know about this monster in terms of his look, his physiognomy, and everything else about his face? What do we know about him? He's abhorrent to look at. That's right. He's abhorrent to look at, isn't he? He's physically grotesque. People see this monster and their first instincts are to go, stay away. But interestingly, the old blind man, right? The old blind man, he can't see. Shelley's making an interesting observation about the way society makes decisions about people simply by the way they look. A blind man can't see how ugly, how horrific physically he is, and takes care of him, attends to him, and the like. How does the story end? Well, the monster ultimately, we're skipping obviously large portions of the novel, but let's get to the end of the story. How does the monster respond to being rejected by society? He becomes a murderer, doesn't he? Yes, he kills, doesn't he? Right? He does kill. He does kill, doesn't he? The, of course, novel will end with Dr. Frankenstein deciding, oh, now, after the monster's done some terrible things, I guess I better try to put an end to this. Where are they by the end of the novel? They are, aren't they? Way up in the north in the ice. And of course, the objective is for Frankenstein to try to take responsibility and ultimately to destroy his creation. End of story. Now, let's begin by first of all asking about this story the question that I asked a few moments ago. Why were religious readers of this story offended and called it a very dangerous story? Can you write down in your notes one reason why you think this might have been the case? Go ahead, give it a try. One reason why, and again, don't write down they didn't like the idea of bringing people back from the dead, because they didn't believe that to be a true part of the story. That was, if you will, part of the entertainment of the story, okay? Mr. Nelson, help us out. Why would European religious readers of the story say, this is a really dangerous story and should not be read, especially by young people, by the way? Why?
Was it perhaps because the creation was questioning the creator?
To the degree that what? In this story, the monster challenges the creator? Mm-hmm. It's a fine observation. And it does happen in this novel, doesn't it? No doubt. And you're very close, Mr. Nelson, but not quite there. So I want us to keep thinking. What is it about this novel that religious people would consider to be very dangerous? Mr. Keeley?
Is it just the suggestion itself of someone being able to create life? Again, they kind of read the novel and understood, this is all mythic, this is all mythology. I know they know that it didn't happen, but it's the suggestion itself is what I'm saying.
That one should try to do something like bring dead people back from the dead.
Because the fact that it could convince other people to try to do that.
I see. It's a fine guess. No? Mr. Harder.
Not having a soul, the monster. I mean, he just has life.
Now this is an interesting one, and it's kind of a little bit of a wrinkle on what Mr. Keeley's saying. The notion that does the monster have a soul or not? Of course, no. The only real reason why that would become a real question is if you accept the fact that a monster could be brought back from the dead. Again, these religious readers don't believe that. Ralph Lutner.
Like the clash between science and religion.
Clash between science and religion. We certainly can kind of see a little of that happening in this novel, no doubt. Much like Nelson, you're very, very close to understanding why it is religious readers were so offended by the novel. Mr. Giudice.
Didn't they not want to corrupt their children?
They didn't want to corrupt their children, but why would this novel lead to the corruption of their children? Like, what is it in this novel that's so corruptible in its essence? Like, why? Why would a kid sit down, read this novel, and go, oh, and then religious people would be, oh, bad.
Because it gets them thinking.
That, of course, is true, but then that's true of almost all great works of literature. It makes you think.
Yeah.
Like question their religion, maybe?
Yeah.
In what way, though, question their religion?
Like when you-
The question of whether there's a God. Now, why would this novel doubt that?
Well, because like people like in that religion, they think that God created them.
Yes.
Like a man can create
Yes.
them.
Once again, this is the wrinkle already on Mr. Keeley's observation. But again, remember, the most sophisticated readers of this novel who are religious, they didn't buy at all the notion that anything was being brought back from the dead. Okay, that was not for them. How should one say, a problematic component of the novel.
Miss Evelyn, is it? You bet. You bet. Apparently someone needs to see you in the office real quickly.
All right, let's answer this question, shall we? Here's the answer. I'm going to say it, and then I'm going to say it a second time. That way Mr. Durant's brilliant mind can start to put it all together. What if you don't read this novel as literal? Because religious readers who were offended by this novel didn't. What if you read this novel as allegorical? Write that down, and then we'll start defining it. I'll give you a couple of words, Mr. Lang, to kind of help with this idea. Reading the novel as allegorical, reading the novel as symbolic, reading the novel as metaphoric. But allegorical is the better word here. What do we mean by allegory? One thing represents something else. One thing represents something else. In other words, you look at the storyline of a text, okay? And then you ask about that storyline, is there any way to understand it in relationship to real life, you see? Okay? Mr. Keeley, thinking now.
Is it because they think that Frankenstein could represent the creator and the monster would be his mistake, so God's mistake is us?
What is the mistake of God?
Yes. Did you hear what Mr. Keeley just said? Mr. Nelson, all of a sudden, now the connections are starting to be made. Wait a minute. Let's follow it allegorically in the novel. Frankenstein creates a monster. Did the monster ask to be created? Nope. How does Frankenstein treat the monster after its creation? Question, does Frankenstein take responsibility for the monster or not take responsibility for the... Does not.
Abandons it. Shameful.
How does the monster then behave by the end of the novel? Good or bad?
Goes on killing spree.
Bad. Now to the fundamental question that Mr. Keeley was taking us towards. In the novel, do you blame the monster for his terrible murders? Or rather, are you inclined to say, it isn't the monster's fault. He was created, poorly educated and treated, abandoned by its creator. And to that degree, the bad things the monster does cannot be the monster's fault. The responsibility falls on the creator, not the created. Now Harder's thinking.
Well, I'm thinking, like, people are still blaming because they have free will, so it's not...
In the story of Frankenstein, let's not jump to people in free will yet. In the story, in the story of Frankenstein, because Mr. Harder is obviously going to take us there. He has to, right? Has to. In the story of Frankenstein, though, just stay there for a moment. Can you at all find any real way to blame this creature for his response of violence, bad stuff, after he has not chosen to be created and then abandoned by the creator and maligned by, this is important, society? Society, remember, rejects this monster, does not include him. The monster's then response is violence. But do you blame the monster for that? Or are you more inclined to see? Mr. Giudice goes, it's kind of a stretch to blame the monster. You inevitably have to really lay the blame at the guy who creates this thing and then abandons him to society and the rejection of society, namely Dr. Frankenstein. Observation first from Mr. Lang.
I think a stretch is too far. I think you gotta go beyond the stretch to blame the monster. Because I mean, he did everything. He asked. He said, "I'll leave if you give me a mate."
Mr. Lang is saying it's actually wrong to blame the monster. The only one you can blame in this story is the creator.
Because all he wanted was to be happy and to have someone. And he said he disappeared and never be seen again as long as he had somebody to go with. And Frankenstein still told him no.
Can you see all of a sudden why religious readers of the day would say, whoa, 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 Miss Shelley here, at the age of 18, she is subverting one of the fundamental doctrines of Christian theology. Of course, Mr. Harder was taking us there, that all humans are born with this notion of agency or free will, and therefore, when some cat walks into the Big Mac and blows away 15 people because he didn't get, pickles on his burger, right? Some guy walks into the Big Mac and blows away 15 people because he doesn't get, pickles on his burger. We have a tendency, when we do that, to ask the question, do we blame that person? Or do we blame the poor, soul that didn't put pickles on his Big Mac? Or do we blame somebody else? In other words, when people misbehave, now let's use clinical language, when acts of deviancy happen, who do you blame? Do you blame the individual who commits the act? Or do you rather blame any series of other possibilities? For example, the cat who walks into the Big Mac and blows away a bunch of people at the age of 15. What if for the last 10 years that kid's just having the ever-living snot beat out of him every day? See, if you find intel out like that, you're inclined to say, well, whoever was doing that to that kid has to bear some responsibility for this kid's actions at the age of 15. Of course, you can keep backtracking that kind of thinking all the way to origination. Shelley seems to be doing this or suggesting this, creating that which is created cannot be held responsible. The creator must be held responsible, if not in whole, at least in part, for the deviant behavior that maybe the created will commit. Well, that's one way to look at this novel. Again, there's a multiple number of ways to look at this novel. I'm going to give you another way to look at this novel. And now we're going to get even closer to this thing about the modern Prometheus. Because Shelley calls the novel the Modern Prometheus, and then immediately in so doing, she is going to elicit a certain kind of academic response. Why would I say academic? Because most people don't know who Prometheus is, right? They don't have any sense of that. And because they don't know who Prometheus is, they have difficulty understanding why Frankenstein, the novel is called, subtitled, The Modern Prometheus. So, what we need to do, first of all, is to get some sense from Mr. Duran about who Prometheus is. First of all, it's a story from what time period? Did Shelley invent the story of Prometheus? No. This story comes from what culture? It does. It comes from the Greek culture, some at least 1,000 years before, she writes. You're going to have a story about a cat named Prometheus. What do we know about Prometheus? Tell us, Mr. Durant.
Prometheus was the titan that stole the fire from the gods and gave it to humans.
Prometheus finds fire. He's like, whoa, fire, this is awesome. You can make your food and you can fly airplanes into buildings and they come down. Yes. Right? Fire. Let's point out, in other words, fire both helpful as well as destructive. That's my point, yes? Prometheus says to Zeus, King God, I'm going to share this amazing kind of secret with humans of the world. Zeus says back to him, you will not.
He will not.
That's right. I do. All right. You bet. Miss Elon, I guess you're supposed to now go or something. I don't know, that's what they said.
So Prometheus says to Zeus, I'm going to give this fire to humans. Zeus goes, no, you are not. And Prometheus does one of these. I will. To Zeus. To God. He does this. To God. And Zeus goes, you do this, you're getting seriously bummed. I'm telling you in advance. Prometheus says, I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway. And that's exactly what he does. That's exactly what he does. So he shares fire with humans. Humans go, yay! Now we can cook our food and fly airplanes into buildings. And Prometheus is punished. His punishment is an interesting one. He's crucified. Go ahead, Mr. Durant.
Yeah, like you said, I think he's crucified and he's chained to a rock where vultures come
Right.
and scratch at his
Right,
liver.
right. There's different translations. Sometimes it's a vulture, sometimes it's an eagle, sometimes it's another kind of bird. Comes and eats at his heart, eats it out every day, but then it grows back over the night so that the bird can come and eat it out some more. But this is an important part of our story. At no point, Prometheus is in excruciating pain, crucified to a rock, as this bird's eating out and pecking out his heart every day. But during all of this pain, never once does Prometheus ever say to Zeus, I'm sorry. Please, please, please forgive. No. Zeus will say to Prometheus, are you ready to be, forgiven? No. Prometheus continues, I do it 1,000 times again. In other words, let's just say it. The Promethean character is the defiant character. The Promethean character is the one who looks at deity and says, up yours, I'll do it anyway. Right? That's Prometheus. Now, Mary Shelley writes a novel about a cat who decides to bring somebody back from the dead. The monster does some terrible things, and in the end he has to try to kill the monster. That's the storyline. 20 words or less. But she calls the novel The Modern Prometheus. Now you're going to write a paper where you're going to try and come up with 3 reasons why you think she called the novel The Modern Prometheus. I'll help you here by asking the question a different way. Namely this: in what ways is Frankenstein Promethean? Okay. Now, to help us get there, we're going to now engage in a little thought experiment. Okay? You can put your pens down. Trust me, you ain't going to forget this storyline. I got to tell you the story, then I'm going to ask you the question, then I want you to try and write down an answer or two. You are a medical researcher working in your lab. Let's make it late at night and you're all alone. It's fun when that kind of thing happens in scary movies, right? Through a series of events that we'll not be able to explain, somehow or another, certain chemicals combine, and you discover the ability to take a little drop of that material that's been combined, and when you put it on the tongue of a dead mouse, a lab mouse, the mouse comes back to life. You conduct studies on the mouse and determine that it is completely healthy in every way. You take another mouse, you drown it, you take it out of the water, you put the water on its tongue, bam, it comes back immediately alive. Just so happens your lab is in the same building as a pal of yours who works in the basement, and he's a coroner. You run down there in the middle of the night, the guy's working on a dead body, and you say, look, dude, can you just take a walk for a little bit? I want to try something. The guy walks out of the room. You put a drop of this stuff on that dead corpse's tongue, bam. Corpse is back and completely 100% healthy. That's the thought experiment. Now to the question. You have discovered the power to bring people back from the dead. Question. Don't say it, write it. What are you going to do with this power? Now, by the way, this is a philosophic thought experiment. I'm in no way suggesting that somebody would ever actually invent this. I'm asking a philosophic question, so don't get hung up on the nuances of the question, right? Don't get hung up. If they died, for example, in a car wreck and blah, blah. Don't get hung up. This is my simple question. If you had the power to bring people back from the dead, what would you do with that power? It seems to me you have two options, and only really two options. One, you might want to jot this down to decide which one you rather like. One, you immediately destroy this power, and you pretend like you never ever discovered it, and you never speak of it, and you never share that power. Basically, that for you is a major no-no to have discovered this. That's one option. The other option is to use it, either immediately or in the long term. For example, you may decide, I don't think I want to use this right away, but I might use it later, maybe even for myself. For example, leave it in my will and testament that this small pill that I carry with me at all times needs to be placed on my tongue in case of death, that kind of thing. Or you may elect to say, I'm going to use this thing right away. Of course, you do realize you just became the wealthiest person in the history of the world with this power. There are individuals who will pay you trillions of dollars for one drop, right? We know this is true because you're going to bring people back from the dead. A pharmaceutical company will right now write you a check for $1 trillion for this power. Question, what do you do with this power? I'm more intrigued with and why. So don't just write down in your notes what you're going to do with this power. Write down the and why part. Why is it that you've elected to do whatever it is you say you're going to do with this power? Let's do a quick inventory, shall we? A little McGee Gallup poll in room 303. How many of you say, and I'm going to give 3 options. One option is, I'm going to destroy it immediately. Another option is, I'm going to keep it and use it some way or another. A third option is, I'm not sure. So for those of you who are sitting on the fence, uncertain as to what you would do, you'll raise your hand for the third one. How many of you are absolutely certain the minute you discover this power is the minute you're destroying this power? You will not do this game. No way, no how. We don't play with death. Okay, good. How many of you say, dude, I just got bank in substantial amounts of it, and I'm going to use this? How many of you say, how many of you are like, you know what, this is an unfair question at 8 in the morning on a Friday, and this is too hard for me to, I'm not sure what I would do. I'm still in the decision process. Let's begin with our first group, shall we? Mr. Nelson, let me get this straight. You are saying that a person who you love very much, let's say, has just been in a tragic wreck. And there you are, right? The individual, let's say it's your mom, she has passed away. You're saying, even though you have this power, you will not bring her back from the dead. You will not. Mr. Nelson says no. Now, question, why?
You don't mess with the death.
Don't mess with the death, right? So in other words, person's got to die. It's the time to die. Let it go. It's part of life, is death. And to that degree, don't play God is oftentimes the phrase that even gets used. Yes? Now, question to Mr. Nelson. What about if the same scenario and the doctor comes out, you are there as the one responsible for your mom, and the doctor says, we're losing her. But we have this thingy, boom, boom, that we can put on her chest, boom. And 10 seconds before she flatlines, we can save her. Are you okay with using this technology? Mr. Nelson?
Yes.
Not dead yet.
If it is, you have to use it in order.
Britain has
bring
4
that
minutes
back.
after death before she fully dies.
We're 7 seconds from dying. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, boom, boom.
Dead, no.
You're all right? You're all right with this technology, Mr. Nelson? Mr. Nelson says, I'm okay with the technology to be used before she flatlines. But the minute she flatlines, no technology. That's what he's saying. Even if it's like 2 seconds after she flatlines.
That's kind of